Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the sixth session of the Boston Society for Architecture's Matter and Opinion Existing Building series. Next slide. I'm Lori Ferris, the Director of Sustainability and Climate Action at Goody Clancy, a Boston architecture, planning, and preservation firm, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this sixth session. Today, we are going to focus on higher ed, performing arts, and arts education spaces. And while the series is closing out today, I want to invite you all to watch, revisit, or share any of the other sessions, which you can find on architects.org or the BSA's YouTube channel. Before we go further, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Spalding Brick Company. We could not host any of this programming without our sponsors. Thank you so much. And also thank you to our partners, AIA Central Massachusetts, who are hosting the AIA New England Design Awards this year, AIA Connecticut, AIA Rhode Island, AIA Vermont, AIA Western Massachusetts, the Boston Preservation Alliance, Built Environment Plus, and the Boston chapter of the International Facility Management Association. A reminder that we are recording this session and your registration and attendance includes your consent to the BSA's image and content release policy. And we will be sharing this session later this week for you to access on architects.org, and you will be notified by email once that's posted and available for viewing. And this session has been submitted to for 1 HSW credit. If you'd like to receive continuing education credit or a certificate, please check out the chat and fill out the short Google form that is posted there. The session and the whole series aim to build the will around existing buildings among all constituents by investigating the hurdles and the benefits of existing building work. And in doing this, we can determine what we need as owners, builders, architects, and advocates to embrace existing buildings as many things, but especially as climate solutions. Today, we'll learn about 2 performing arts projects, one for Middlesex Community College and the other for MIT. And following presentations on each of the topics, we'll open it up for a brief discussion and Q&A. So please leave questions in the chat as we go through. And we're going to have to cut our Q&A a little bit short today, ending at 1 instead of 1:30 as originally planned, so that whoever is interested can head over to the Boston Mayoral Candidate Forum on Climate and Equitable Housing, which the BSA is also hosting. And if you're interested in that and haven't signed up, you can RSVP to get the Zoom information using the link that will be posted in the chat. So before we get going, we'll just introduce our speakers all at once. We'll be hearing from Josiah Stevenson, principal at Leers Weinzapfel Associates, Kevin Bell, a senior associate at Leers Weinzapfel, and Karen Oster, the performing arts chair at Middlesex Community College. And then for our second presentation, we'll hear from Kelly Haig and Sam Batchelor, partners at designLAB Architects. So with that, let's begin and I'll hand it over.
Great. I think it's I'm beginning here. So my name's Karen Oster. That's not me. I am the chair of performing arts at Middlesex Community College. And just wanted to give you a little bit of background about Middlesex. We have 2 campuses, one in Bedford and one in Lowell. Our Lowell campus we acquired in 1987, so it's been there for quite a while. It's one of the largest community colleges in Massachusetts. We have about 80+ degree programs and serve about 12,000 students. Middlesex is also a leader in global education and has had a huge impact on the areas in terms of economy and has contributed significantly to the community. MCC also has a history of securing historic buildings with the John Nesmith House, the Federal Building, and the Middlesex Meeting House in Bedford. So this is not something that we're, we haven't done before, but this certainly is, I think, the best out of all of them. So what you're seeing here is our old theater. And it's interesting because you can see from this lovely actress Joan in the front that the top of her hand, it's not an optical illusion, but the top of her hand is actually very close to the ceiling. One of the things in first sort of talking about the performing arts program is that we never really had our own space. The performing arts program at Middlesex has a theater department with two degrees and a music department with 2 degrees, but the music department always had a recital hall in Bedford. So the theater was always kind of this nomad looking for a space. So this particular space you're looking at was acquired, it used to be Chevy's downtown in Lowell across from our main building. And this was a building that was kind of just sitting there open, and Middlesex acquired it and turned it into a small black box theater, which was very charming and wonderful, and very cool to work in. The students loved working in it, but it had some obvious limitations. There was no dressing rooms. There were no, obviously the ceiling height was was obviously not high enough. We would try to do sword fighting in there and couldn't quite make it, but we did it anyway. There was the sound and lighting, the ability for us to do anything or make it as a teaching atmosphere for our students was really pretty non-existent. When I became chair of the department, as soon as I became chair, which is either I don't know, it could be a negative thing, but 2 floods happened in this space. And so I try not to take it personally, but 2 floods did happen in this space. And so the building then pretty much became condemned. We couldn't use it anymore. So then we actually spent a lot of the next few years looking for a space and just kind of renting different places. This particular space, Josiah and Kevin, actually, when they first came to see Chicago, was the first production they saw there. They saw in this old space and what we were dealing with it. So it was right around that time that the college acquired this new building. And if you want to just go ahead, Kevin, and put in the other slide. So you can't really see the ceilings here, but you can see that we definitely had the ability to create more set, do more with the lighting. And obviously the swords were able to reach the top with a lot left over. So what happened was we had nothing. And so of course I wanted everything. It was a tall order for a very limited footprint of what we were getting because we had nothing. So Josiah and Kevin created this incredible space. You actually see behind me right here, our theater now, and the inside of it. And what they created was magical. And they fit quite a bit in a very small footprint. So I'm going to turn it over to these guys now to show you a little bit about what that was about.
Thanks, Karen. I like talking about this building a lot because it was just so unique for us. We've never built a building in the 1800s before, added to a building in the 1800s. And it's good to have Karen, the user, the end user, and the inspiration behind this building involved in this presentation. So I loved Chicago, going to see it. The lead was charismatic and it was just so well done. But the whole time I thought, I hope these guys don't put their hands in those lights. And so they really needed a new building. So it actually was a relief to hear that it was condemned. So this is, so Middlesex Community College has this history of upgrading antique buildings and making it their own. For example, the federal courthouse and post office, they got that and turned it into the college library. And an old Wang building, probably built in the 80s, became their administration building. And then this building, an old train station, was to become a theater. And I think I can mark on this, I'm not sure. But Towers Corner is where the site is, which is right. I can't mark on. See the Y there? Right, yeah, there you go. So that's where a lot of streets come together, and it's really the gateway to the downtown, to the historic downtown. And that little horizontal bar is the train station and its tracks, built in 1876. So even now, when you come in, say from the south, from the Lowell connector, and make your way through the city streets past residences, once you hit this point, Towers Corner, it's like the gateway to all the historic buildings. So this is a view back in the day from Towers Corner. And actually, the truth is, if you just change the cars and eliminate a couple of buildings, it's kind of what it looks like now. And the building in question is the one on the right where it says Rialto. That was the train station. Next. So the history of this building is really a tale of woe. It began in 1876 as a train station. This is the head house to 2 tracks beyond. And this isn't the Boston to Lowell train. This is the Newburyport to Lowell train, and this was its terminus. So that line didn't last too long. But you see there are 5 doors along the front, very much open public space. And then the next slide, it only lasted until 1900. Then it became a telephone telegraph building. And that lasted until it became the Rialto Theater. And I don't have a picture of the Rialto Theater except this ticket where it says, this theater has not been in any way damaged by water. So that's a good sign for Karen's flood problem that she had. Next slide. Then disaster struck, if you're a historicist in any way. The Rialto Theater became the Rialto bowling lanes. And they sheared off the towers. They eliminated any of the detailing at the cornice. The first floor became a series of signs, and it was on its way down. And the next slide is really, I think, despite the fact that the Lowell National Historic Park Service rebuilt the cornice part, it was the beginning of its vacancy period. And that it was longer vacant than it was a theater, a bowling alley, a telephone building, or a train station. So, and as the gateway to the downtown, it's kind of an unfortunate embarrassment. So that was 1988. Then 2011, the Lowell National Historic Park Service, next slide, got money to bring it back to its old self a little bit to some degree, and they rebuilt the towers. Meanwhile, if you go into the building at this point, you could see through the missing mortar, through 3 wise thick missing mortar, the outside of the building. So it just struck me that this building, I know they made it more beautiful by adding more stuff to making it more historic. It had no structural integrity whatsoever, and it really became one of the challenges that we had at hand. So next slide. So this is kind of the design idea. The idea was to repair the old, but everything that's new is distinct and different from that. So the college has a new element that's in the heart of Lowell. Next slide. So the egg as the metaphor became an egg as in a plan only because the backstage wanted to be fatter. So it's sort of, it was not intended, but that seemed to make the most sense. So in the lower left, you see the entrance to the theaters on the first floor, and then you descend down to the basement.
It's our finance meeting.
Which is the theater. And then second floor is the performing arts space.
1:30, okay.
And the dance studio. And then also you see the original structure, and there's a back piece. So in the end, there were 4 towers. There was the entry tower, there was the stair tower. In the back, this new element was a cooling tower and an elevator tower. So there you see the idea in model form. Next slide, please. And then this, I'm not going to spend time on the actual drawings, but you can see the entry area in the left on the first floor, and then you can get into the back of the theater, and it's all fully accessible, and you can take the elevator down and get into the front of the theater in the basement, and that's fully accessible as well. Next. So this is probably my moment of highest anxiety on this project, as like, you know, a hurricane was coming up the coast, because this is holding up these, look at the stair tower to the right, and look at that little thin brick column with a steel column next to it. It just didn't seem like it was going to last too long. Next slide, please. So this egg became this massive structure. It was the horizontal resistance. It took all the loads basically. And it's basically a 10-inch concrete block, fully grouted structure that held on to the existing outside structure. And on the subject of renovations and embodied carbon, which is an important issue here, obviously building reuse is the best thing to do for that. And then next on the list would be wood or mass timber. And then it gets worse and worse, steel, and then concrete. So here we're doing is adding massive amounts of concrete to this building. And it reminded me of a guy I used to work with. He used to come in the morning with a healthy drink and a Danish filled with sugar. And I said, you can't put those two together because one is bad for you. The other one is good. And he said, well, bad and good means even. I'm even. So at first I thought, if we're adding all this concrete, it's pretty even. But the truth is, if you're building a theater, you're building something that resists sound transmission from the outside, and this is in the city. So I think it's still in the net positive range. Next. And then this is when it's done. You can make out this volume inside. The color changing LEDs are up to Karen if you want to, if it's showtime and they're doing Chicago or something, it could be red and maybe green if it was a Midsummer Night's Dream or something like that. So that's kind of a fun element to the project. And then I'm going to not go through because we don't have much time, through the plans. It's not really worth discussing, but there's the first floor. You come into the theater from the back and descend next. And this is the basement where you can get around to the accessibility on the lower level. It's a very steep rate, dropping one floor next. And this is the performance space and the dance studio in blue next. And then this is an image of the entry lobby, which wraps around the theater. So it's kind of a mingling space between acts next. And then this is the theater, good sight lines and a flat floor for the stage next. And then this is the performance space on the second floor. We work with a Centec on the acoustics of that because, you know, the focal point of a curve is not very good acoustically. So each of these baffles, these panels are angled slightly differently. And then this is the dance studio on the other side. And then finally, on the rear of the building, we added a couple of feet of mechanical spaces. And in Lowell, if you look around, some of these historic buildings have these little appendages in the back, and they're often aluminum or steel, like elevators and things like that. So this is in that spirit. And at the elevator tower is a Chicago image that's taken from Richard Gere's, not Richard Gere. And on the other side is the musical part, which is the piano. So, and Kevin will talk about much more detail about this now.
Thanks, Josiah. Just going to touch on two things. Josiah alluded to kind of that shoring challenge with the existing historic envelope, and then a little bit on sustainability. So it's a little bit about how you get from design to here. This is an image of the building when it opened. Gosh, the pandemic has my time off. So it was like 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. I can't remember anymore. Something pandemic plus a year maybe. So as you know, Josiah said, the existing building you could see through in a lot of ways. And so the first piece of restoring this facade, it had been added to, and the Park Service had done, you know, some yeoman's work trying to piecemeal bring it back from the brink. What we did is laser scanned it, you know, to document the interior, and then walked it on a number of occasions to identify basically down to the brick, which bricks needed to be replaced, what cracking and failed arches and all that needed to be upgraded, and really it's a substantial amount of the building. I think it's 100% repointing on the exterior, and what I say about 102% repointing on the interior. From there, Consigli was our CM, and they worked with DM Berg to develop that temporary bracing system. And I think what's most important about this is what it means to brace the exterior during construction and what that affects. And obviously this temp bracing is coordinated with the existing structure. It needs to be coordinated with the new permanent structure. It needs to be coordinated with all the underslab utilities, any major duct and pipe routing, as well as simply the construction sequencing, because the temp shoring, you're seeing these really long kickers, running from basically bedrock up to the roof of the building, but all of those have to go in when the existing structure is there and come out when the new structure is there. So it's thinking about just about every system in the building, and this temp bracing system has to avoid it and be able to go in and out basically without being the worst challenge in the world, which it was substantial. So just a few images to kind of walk through. It's the image Josiah showed is pretty incredible, and this kind of tells the story of how we get to that. Image on the left here is actually one of the underpinning subs. This is, he's actually tucking his head under a corner of the £500,000 tower. I think that's the final section of underpinning that had to go in. So we had to underpin portions of the building before we could begin to brace it, had to actually reconstruct huge portions of the interior of the building so it was structurally sound to brace. And then they came in. The temp shoring in our case were close to bedrock, so that's good. So these kickers are actually anchored to the bedrock with 12-foot long rock anchors to keep them in place throughout construction. And then you can see these images that those pieces of those kickers and that getting assembled in the existing building, slowly making their way up to the roof, which then allows demo and recycling of that existing structure. And really the big reason, two big reasons why the existing structure just wasn't adequate. One, it was wood, but it wouldn't support assembly loading. We have assembly loading at all 3 floors here. And the second piece is the roof had pretty much failed. And so that was going to need to be replaced. So a huge part of this building needed to come down anyways. And so we actually did a study during design to see, what we could save, and came to the realization that we couldn't save much on the interior. And it was best programmatically, and for the facade, the kind of important element that everyone was really committed to and attached to preserve that was to do this new structure on the inside. And on the right here, you see that kind of mangrove roots coming off the existing building down to bedrock. And then just a few images of building up around that temp shoring, including a 0 lot line, single-sided concrete wall on the one side that is new, and a lot of concrete going in to deal with that. On the left here, we're in the theater. This is all the temp shoring coming through. To be quite frank, we could not have done this form out of concrete, cast in place concrete. It could really only be done out of CMU, just because of, I think we had 46 holes in that wall for the temp steel, and another 60 or so for permanent steel. So to have a mason, to have a craftsman on site that could actually work with the engineer, work with the CM, and work with the design team to figure out how to build this wall around, not just at the theater, but elsewhere around all this temp shoring was an amazing task. And really the folks that did it were really fabulous, and just bringing that up to a second floor level and ultimately to the roof. What happens is, and this is another, to Josiah's point, in order to get this steel out, it had to be cut into small pieces and taken out by hand once the permanent structure was in place. So steel is highly recyclable. That's the piece we kind of hang our hat on when it comes to this, but there was actually more temporary steel in this building than permanent steel. And so that brings us to kind of sustainability around this. We're doing a lot to an existing building. And kind of the first point to make is what both Karen and Josiah alluded to. What's the highest and best use for a historic building in this context? And a point was important to us, and I think conveyed to everyone, is that this building really had a lot of lives, and we know, the college being a good steward of buildings, that quite frankly, this building will be a theater for the college for more than any other life it's had. So having a user that can adopt a building and make it their home and take care of it means that we're going to have a building that's used and lasts for a very long time into the future. The other piece being, they're in the city. The college has made a commitment to open this urban campus, to acquire buildings and restore them, and to be a really active and vital piece of the city. And this building helps them expand that. So in that sense, there really wasn't anyone else who could save this building. It was really the college, and kind of proof of that is that it took 30 years to get it saved. So I think that's an important piece of sustainability when it comes to historic construction, is really making sure that you have that kind of highest and best use for it, so that it really does last into the future. On this building, it's very small, it's about just under 20,000 square feet. And so we're Executive Order 484 compliant, but we used the National Building Institute's new construction guide as our way of satisfying EO 484. And that's a prescriptive system. It's a prescriptive system of measures you can take that through modeling and other means, they've determined you get real meaningful energy efficiency improvements out of the building. So we treated the building to the extent we could as a new building, and really limited where we couldn't meet these measures at the tier 2 level, just to the existing building, where really durability was the major component. So broadly speaking, we brought the envelope efficiency way up, and quite frankly, even the existing historic masonry walls, we were able to get them very near to at least code compliant insulation levels, while still keeping them breathable and allowing that moisture to both move into the space and out to the exterior, so that basically that exterior wall that's been able to breathe for 140 years could continue to breathe. We're on an urban campus in a city, and there's no central plant, so we don't get the benefits that a lot of academic buildings, particularly on campuses in the Northeast, have, which is campus utilities like chilled water and hot water. So our building, and the reason we needed so much mechanical space here, is because we have a plant in the building. We have a chiller, we have boilers. And so the prescriptive system that the new construction guide applies really gives you kind of guide rails to work within and meet measures. And it can be really beneficial just overall, because there isn't necessarily gray areas. If you meet these prescriptive measures, you have a good chance of being energy efficient. So it's great when there's so much more to deal with in an existing historic building that might take precedent and priority over other things. Important to us, and actually a really great benefit of the existing building, part of the reason why it requires so much bracing, is the number of windows in it. It's a really porous facade as far as windows go, and so we tried to organize the public spaces and the spaces that could be daylit around the exterior, and quite frankly, we have some spaces that are restrooms and that are actually beautifully daylit, even with translucent glass, because we wanted to bring light in as much as possible and maintain that transparency to the outside that the original building had. And by that same method, thinking about well-being, making sure that these theater spaces, theater, recital hall, dance space, one could operate at the same time as teaching spaces. We're so packed in that the recital hall sits over the theater. And so there's this fairly complex floor system between the two that isolates it. So Karen and Carmen and others can teach in the space. And then that egg form, if you will, that CMU really helps isolate the interior from the exterior. So even though we're in a busy city and there's frequent traffic going by on three sides, once you move into the theater through the vestibules and into the recital hall, it's really quiet and calm. We didn't pursue LEED on this project because we used that alternative method, but we did want to make sure that those sort of criteria that we attribute to LEED frequently, that we still incorporated those. So although we weren't seeking LEED certification here, we did require certified wood and low emitting materials, and obviously construction demolition waste, tracking and diversion, as well as maintaining all the construction indoor air quality requirements so that it's a safe, healthy place to be in the end. And that continues. This is actually Karen's office. Sorry, Karen, I'm showing it. Kind of resilience in this context is both resilience against, on the right here, you're seeing we had a water main break during construction, and the pipe in Lowell is so old that oftentimes it's been leaking for a long time and carving out basically underground caverns that connect the buildings. So this was a water main leak that brought 3 feet of water into the building during construction. So as part of our design and part of making this building as viable as possible was to get program into the basement, and that meant a waterproofing program under slab drainage that worked with, in fact, an under slab depressurization system. We're right on granite here, and knowing that Karen and her students, the kids in this building, it is a second home for them. We wanted to make sure that we were eliminating any potential for someone who's in this building for a long time to have any exposure to radon. So we have an entire depressurization system under the building as well. And there's other measures too to make sure we don't get backwater from the sewer system, which is combined, and that the whole space stays dry and safe for teaching. And then finally, on designing for change, although Karen and her team use these spaces quite frequently, it was important to the college that they be able to use it as lecture space, as meeting space, as seminar space. And so even in our recital hall, which was meant to be very quiet and devoid of technology, we tucked some things away so that those spaces could be used by the rest of the college, so that it was always, it was flexible enough to accommodate different uses, even though these are highly technical and specific spaces. And then Josiah alluded to design for discovery. So Karen and her folks have in this building really a tool for teaching the craft of theater. And part of that is we gave them, I shouldn't say we gave them, we all gave them because it's a state project, 3 lighting control systems, one in the theater, one for the recital space, and one for these, for the egg wall lighting. And her students and her program can experiment with this. They can make, they can use it for their performances, but also just use it as a way to teach, maybe even an introduction to building systems and building controls. So aside from simply, the craft of theater in the space and using catwalks and sets and all that, there are ways, for students to really interact with the building on multiple levels. And so I think that's it. This is just the image of the building from a little block away. And if anyone's been to Lowell, the new courthouse is behind us. So I think that's it on MCC. Sam and Kelly.
All right, thanks. Let me share my screen here.
Yep.
All right, is that showing up as full screen for everyone? All right, so Kelly and I are going to talk for a few minutes about the MIT Theater Arts building on Vassar Street. For a little bit of context about our work, we do a lot of work in adaptive reuse with existing buildings, and as part of that have developed a philosophy called critical stewardship, which is really operating at the intersection of history and sustainability. And so we've had the privilege of working on real sort of architectural gems from turn of the century to mid-century icons like Paul Rudolph's UMass Dartmouth work, as well as sort of nondescript utilitarian buildings, which is kind of where this project falls. And so it's kind of interesting in the context of all of those buildings, sort of both the commonalities and differences of approaches in terms of working with existing buildings. Also, it's worth a little bit of context on MIT's campus planning, and Jennifer Marshall from MIT would want us to make sure that we hit on this. So, those of you who are locals may know a lot of this, but I'll just zip through it. MIT was originally on the Boston side of the river. And then when the Back Bay was filled in and developed, there was an opportunity for MIT to get a lot of land on the Cambridge side. So that precipitated their move to Cambridge. The original structures for MIT on the Cambridge side are the sort of classic dome and courtyard, which remain to this day. But of course, MIT is now a much larger campus entity that has grown to over 168 acres and 12.5 million square feet. It also has a large kind of research component compared to the kind of pure academic setting. So the yellow buildings in this diagram are the kind of the pure academic buildings, and the purple buildings are their research counterparts. So that you can see it kind of grows from the central core of campus along the river farther into Cambridge. So our project for the Theater Arts Department grew out of some enabling work for a new life sciences project in Kendall. Their original building, the Rinaldi tile factory, was right in Kendall. And so as it was this sort of nondescript former tile factory / automotive garage, was prime real estate for life sciences. So they got bumped, and on the plus side, they got a new home out of it.
So a little bit of background on the program itself and kind of what we were working with starting out on the project. The first thing was quite a bit of growing pains with the MIT Music and Theater Arts program. It had recently become a new bachelor's program of science in theatrical arts, and there was quite a bit of increase that was associated with that. What was formerly kind of a creative outlet for engineering students was now something that had a bachelor's degree in its own right. And as Sam said, it did operate for years here in the heart of Kendall Square in the Rinaldi tile factory. And so this space was, it was really used kind of every inch inside this building for a whole host of theatrical purposes. So, spaces were underutilized. There were a lot of really non-ideal conditions. Their spaces were undersized and used for 5 things at a time. And what was interesting is while the space was dysfunctional, it also led to this continuous kind of collaboration, prototyping, feedback, integration of all the program that was really became kind of core and signature to their program and how they wanted to design. So within just this small space of the Rinaldi tile factory, they had, drawing classes, design classes, lighting, set design, costume. They had performances with this big cube that they just kind of outfit and made it a quasi set in the middle of their scene shop. So it was very like kind of hands-on and behind the scenes. And so they also, just given the size and how many people they could fit into the building, had programming that was really distributed outside of Rinaldi in quite a number of different locations. So, you know, part of this project was to consolidate that.
So the new location for the Theater Arts Building was this site at 345 Vassar. And it, as I mentioned before, was sort of a nondescript utilitarian structure. But because of that, had the benefit of this kind of similarly blank canvas as the Rinaldi building. And so as part of that, it, in addition to kind of hosting all of these functions that were in the Rinaldi building and were being consolidated from other buildings, the biggest opportunity programmatically was to actually integrate a proper performance space into the department space, as well as to create some real identity and presence for them on campus, in particular here on Vassar Street.
So the question of identity was a big one because, like Sam said, this was a completely anonymous kind of underwhelming structure and not the most prime location. So they really wanted something that, you know, really reflected the character and kind of quality of the program that they developed over time. And they really actually quite liked the grit that came with the historic structure. It was, you know, reminiscent of the Rinaldi tile factory. So we were really trying to look at spaces to ways to make this project feel and seem like them. But one of the interesting, I guess, asides is that, you know, we often are tasked with, because we work on buildings of lots of different levels of preciousness. It's like, what is the value inherent in the structure? And I think similarly to the one Leers tackled, this was a 0 lot line building and we could fit the amount of square footage we needed for the program. Beyond that, there wasn't a whole lot that this existing structure was giving us. So it was giving us kind of the zoning opportunity to achieve what we wanted and to save some of the kind of existing carbon, but it wasn't that, you know, the structure itself lent to theater art. So from a kind of intervention perspective, we had this two-part building and we inserted this double height addition that was the performance space and lobby. And in the planning of it, you know, the idea was that we were really going to make sure that all the spaces, both front and back of house, were part of the experience. So all the adjacencies, kind of, you know, spaces spilled to one another. They all opened into these communal mixing spaces. It was really important that, you know, both the making and the performing were one and the same. And so as kind of visual inspiration, it was interesting. Very early on, we were looking at ways of overcladding and screening. And from the theater department's perspective, you know, screens are very much about kind of the tech and the sciences and the lab buildings. And, you know, they were like, we have a different character on campus. And so there was a lot of teasing out what that is. So these are two pieces of art that came out of this conversation with the theater folks, looking at Louise Nevelson and this Lawrence Weiner installation that really kind of shaped the architecture itself. So, you know, we were looking at ways to kind of make all of these unique pieces and things that happened feel integrated as a whole. And so that really kind of led to some of the ideas behind the facade intervention, where we basically, as a concept, closed in all the masonry walls and kind of set back the brick so that you could read that history as part of it. We painted it all black as like just kind of creating a shell. And then we cut in openings where we needed to either access the building or reveal something inside or really kind of showcase things that are happening. And so, you know, and it was important to us that we weren't just showing the performance itself, but that we're showing where they're building, where they're designing, where they're loading and unloading, and that's all kind of what animates the street edge. And I think one of the descriptors that Sarah Brown, the director of design, gave us early on is that they wanted a building that was beautiful but unprecious. Which we thought was just a really wonderful way to think about architecture. So the material palette was very, we had a few materials that we leveraged, to their greatest extent. We were looking at, ways to highlight kind of remnants of the building and save the grit. We did fully insulate it, so a lot of the kind of grit and floors were no longer in their historic state, but we found ways to leverage other pieces of it. And actually just make sure that you could enable the arts in all spaces. So this was that demising wall between the two structures that didn't need to be insulated. So that became a feature wall in the backdrop of our primary stair. And then all the stairs and railings throughout were made of Schedule 40 pipe, so they could kind of rig and install, throughout the building kind of as flexibly as possible. And what has been just really wonderful is to see how they've really gravitated toward it. This was their opening brochure, opening night, and we were just really excited. I think Karen said something earlier, like, I'm the recipient of this building, that they, for us, the idea that the end user like really owns it and loves it is really amazing. So we were really thrilled to see them kind of take this and kind of turn it into its own identity.
In terms of specific projects, outcomes and lessons learned from almost 2 years of occupancy at this point. First, from a sort of adaptation and sustainability standpoint, I mean, as Kelly mentioned, on what was the kind of one-story portion of the building where we inserted the theater, similar to what was going on at the other project, there wasn't a lot of ability to save much beyond the exterior walls. We had originally we inserted the theater in the center 2 bays of the kind of 4-bay structure, but by the time we sort of tried to shore up the outer 2 bays and drop this structure in, it really just made more sense to basically replace the roof level at this 1 story. The 2-story portion remained completely structurally intact, which did present some ceiling height challenges for some of the rehearsal spaces, but ultimately, the sort of cost and sustainable benefits from keeping those structures were worth it, and we were able to make those work. So it was a sort of 2-sided approach to that. Similarly, these new spaces now were able to completely serve the various functions of the program, not just performance, as Kelly mentioned. So this is the main scene shop, which is adjacent to the theater and the lobby. So you have direct access to this right off the lobby, and you have views into that scene shop from the street. So again, in keeping with the spirit of how they operated at Rinaldi, the process is as front and center as the performance. The other thing that's been really interesting is some of the cross-institution collaboration. Even though MIT and BU are not necessarily thought of as super adjacent, the new Booth Theater and Vassar Street are actually very, very close, less than a couple minutes walk right across the BU Bridge. And they've had some really interesting kind of conversations and collaborations about performances and resource sharing and just kind of cross-disciplinary engagement between the 2 institutions there. From a community engagement standpoint, it's a pretty interesting location because even though it is on the kind of campus side of things, there is this train track that runs through Cambridge right here with limited crossing points. And we've got 3 of them called out here. And so that does kind of isolate the residential neighborhood from the MIT campus. But there are, it's starting to become more permeable. The Sydney Street here is kind of one of the main research corridors for MIT. But, Flower Bakery, I live right near here, so it's pretty interesting to sort of see this evolve, but it's starting to get, people onto the MIT side, and it's become a blurring of lines, even though there's a pretty hard boundary with that railroad track. And that, it is sort of an oddly industrial kind of section of Cambridge. And so it is nice to have it start to be enlivened with activity and students and performances for the public and things like that. So it's become a bit of a really nice placemaking piece for that corner of Cambridge as well.
And just the last few things that have been outcomes of this with historic buildings, oftentimes you end up, with kind of nooks and crannies of spaces that you're trying to figure out what to do with them. They're kind of they predate the project. And so, in this one, it was interesting because we actually made a series of, in these little nooks and crannies, some mixing spaces, some, sitting and kind of just, off the beaten track. Spaces that have actually, we found, have been really instrumental because since the building is so remote to the heart of campus, a lot of students stay there in between classes. And so it becomes kind of a touchdown point. And so all of these spaces that we were, finding like ways to kind of sit people, have been really important to just the student experience. And it's interesting because it's also become kind of a source of inspiration in a way that we hadn't anticipated. They use it to think about scale, to think about set design, how, people can kind of enter and move through a space. So these are sketches by students that they've done as part of their kind of set and design studios, where they're really looking at, the various kind of spaces throughout the building to test out things, in real time. And in the next couple, it's like spaces that we hadn't even considered, like high priority design spaces. The dressing rooms and green rooms are similarly really have become part of that design process. More. And what we like is, again, to this idea of a continuous studio. These are all images we took opening night, and they had not only, are the spaces intended to be used, but they think of them as like sequencing performance as you move through the building. So they had all of the various programs kind of installed in different rooms throughout to just really showcase like the, smattering of offerings that they have and all the different collaborations, which has been really wonderful. And just seeing how all of that then feeds back into the primary performance space, and how it's really interactive, and it has, this blurring of kind of audience and performers and projection and set design, all of that kind of comes together as one, has been really amazing.
Yeah, I mean, what I love about this collection of images is only this one in the lower center is of the actual performance space. The rest of these are rehearsal spaces, studios, faculty offices, and they're all transformed and used as either performance spaces or spaces to showcase the production of what it takes to get to performance.
And that's just another image of from their performance space.
Right. Well, thank you all. Those are two really impressive projects, lovely presentations. I think we probably have time for one question. I haven't seen any audience questions come in, but please feel free to send them our way before we wrap up. And if not, maybe I'll just ask each team to briefly comment on maybe the most interesting thing you learned from your existing building during the course of your project. Start with designLAB.
Most interesting thing we
Most
learned.
interesting.
I mean, I guess I don't know if it's something we learned, but I think the most interesting thing we took was this thing that Kelly already mentioned about this idea about it being beautiful but unprecious, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the existing building is still an artifact, still
Mm-hmm.
something to be celebrated, but that it's not precious. It's not sacred. And so, they really, as part of their pedagogy, they're in the mindset of, screwing things to the wall and repainting it when it suits them and all of this. So really designing a space with that in mind, I think, was probably the most meaningful thing we took from this project.
Great.
Kevin,
thanks.
any thoughts?
I think that, I mean, the building kind of personifies preservation as the story we wish to tell about the building, right? Like the building had towers and it didn't, and it had, this, original storefront or this all glass storefront at some point. So for me, it was a bit about finding the story that collectively the Park Service, the college, City of Lowell, previous owners, like were telling about the building. And at the end of the day, it's much more maybe the original than perhaps it should even be, given all of the inputs.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. There's so much we learned about construction of old buildings in this case, but it turned out to be, to me, the perception of all the people who this building meant a lot to, including the Park Service and us and the college. And we all had different views. And it was bringing those together that was actually kind of a challenge, actually.
I've got one quick question. In your researches for both of the projects, how much did you look to historians, architectural historians, people who have made a specialty of the Boston area architectural facilities? The Park Service, for example, has an historic resources department. Jack Glassman is one of the people in that group. The BSA has an historic resources committee, of which he is the chair, and they have a very active group. So I was just curious, from having sat in on some of their meetings, those are fantastic resources, both intellectually and in terms of just the raw material of the history of our facilities. So were those of any use to you, or did you draw upon them, or did you use some other sources?
Well, in our case, the Lowell National Historic Park Service came to a lot of the meetings in the outset, and they felt it was their building and they wanted to protect it to the way they wanted it. So we listened to them, and what was important to them. We sort of saw it as, we have to make the building stand up. We have to make the outside the way they see it as was historically appropriate. And then the inside was a new element.
I think too, we had Judy Selwyn was a big part of our project. She's a historic preservationist, particularly around the masonry restoration. Consigli themselves, they do a lot of this type of work. So I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he was a big part of working through this. And to Josiah's point, the Park Service had really, there wasn't funding for this project in the Park Service. So they used bits and pieces of maintenance funding that was left over at the end of the year to do a lot of this work. So it was really a labor of love on their part for about 20 years, trying to piece this building back together. So we drew on all the information they provided, spent a little bit of time ourselves in the stacks at the Historic Society up there, and just even crowdsourcing a little bit of what different folks had on the building to understand how to put some of it back together, but how to be respectful of what was there.
Yeah, I mean, we've worked with Jack and his group on a lot of projects, not specifically on this one. I think, frankly, they've got bigger fish to fry than this building. But we did, can technically consider it just as we would an older building. We worked with Wisjani to make sure that the paint we selected for the exterior was sufficiently breathable that we wouldn't be trapping moisture in the cavity, since we were insulating it now from the inside. And we wanted to try to insulate it from the outside, but from actually not from a historic standpoint, but from a zoning standpoint, we weren't actually allowed to add any depth to the facade. So there were some sort of technical challenges, but from a kind of a quote unquote historic standpoint, there was not a lot of interest in this building.
All right, thanks for the question. I think with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you again to all of the speakers. This is really a wonderful way to end the series. And thank you again to our sponsor and to all of our partners. Again, we will be posting a recording of this to architects.org by the end of this week, and you'll be notified when that's up and available for viewing. And we welcome everyone to head on over to the mayoral forum now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you.